Okay. I think we should get started. Well, I would like to welcome everybody to this panel, which is part of the workshop for the 5th and 6th volume of the Handbook of Labor Economics. The Handbook of Labor Economics is the flagship publication in labor economics, which basically summarizes all the frontier research which happened over the last 15 years. And we had already a really interesting day with 4 talks and 4 presentations. And we are looking forward to the next days. However, the panel is a little bit separate. It is open to the public. We are streaming it on YouTube. And there are many guests from the US, Canada, Asia, and Europe who will participate in one way or another. Now, my role here is to actually say thank you, for those institutions who made this panel and who made this conference possible. That's first of all the Rockwool Foundation, which very generously funded this conference. That is Humboldt University, which again very generously funded this conference, made facilities available and supported us in all different ways. Well, this conference and this panel is also the starting event of Rockwool Foundation Berlin, which will be a new research center we are setting up in Berlin. Rockwool Foundation is the foundation of Rockwool International, and there is already a research center in Copenhagen, and the center here in Berlin will basically, together with the center in Copenhagen, continue to do first-class research in labor public economics for the welfare of the academic community, the public, politics, and provide politicians with knowledge and cutting-edge research to improve welfare in society. I should say you can follow us on Twitter. The Twitter is on those things over there. We are also, of course, on the web, and we have already a great team and look very much forward to the future and have huge ambitions in terms of becoming a really central and key research group, not just here in Berlin, but also together with our partners in Copenhagen in Europe. Now, I would like to thank the many people who have actually worked extremely hard to make the conference and the panel possible. Giacomo, Erin, Quinji, Moritz, Giuseppe, Clara, Ekaterina, Camille, and many others were working extremely hard over the last months and weeks to help organizing this conference. Particular thanks go to Christine and to the boss, Felix, who kind of coordinated in an unbelievable way everything which was important for this conference. Special thanks go also to Daniel Klapper, who will say a few words, the Dean of the Faculty of Humboldt University, for his support, to Kaspar Kofold, the Chief of Staff, and Jan Roses Kaksen, the Chief of Research at Rockwool Foundation Copenhagen, and I am particularly grateful for the unwavering support over the past years to Ellen Schmidt, the CEO of the Rockwool Foundation. Thank you very much, and I really hope, and I am certain that we will flourish in the future. Now, Daniel and Jan will say a little bit about Rockwool Foundation and about Humboldt University. So please, maybe we start with Jan and then with Daniel.
Yes, thank you, Christian. So I'm from the Copenhagen part, the head of research in Copenhagen, and some of you maybe don't know that, but we have been active in research in this Rockwool Foundation's research unit in Copenhagen for nearly 40 years. But this research has mainly had a focus on Denmark and the Scandinavian welfare state and the challenges to the Scandinavian welfare state. A few years ago, we decided to become more international, or at least more European, and by that having a broader perspective. And we decided that we couldn't think of a better place, a better place to start up this new research union than in this beautiful city, Berlin. Further, you can say with the UK out of EU, Berlin also seemed to be the natural choice as the new center in EU. Another thing which has been important for starting this up, not only the location, it is that we convinced you, Christian, to direct it. I cannot think of anyone better. You are a fantastic researcher. You are also German, but with a lot of international luggage. So it was an obvious choice. We also have very high expectation that you, Alexandra, and all the other associates make this a highly recognized institution producing research of the absolute highest level. We look forward to get a physical place because somehow things just become complete when they have their own physical place. But maybe we should see it tomorrow. And it's close now. And actually, as Christian also mentioned, this conference as a starting event, which also show the high quality that we strive for. So thank you to all of you who have made this conference possible. Everybody who has contributed, not least to the speakers, to the panelists, and of course to Humboldt, who has partnered up. Thank you.
Also, a warm welcome from my side. My name is Daniel Klapper. I'm the Dean of the faculty here at Humboldt University. I don't want to talk too long because many things are said, but I want to emphasize that we are very, very proud that we can host this conference and also this special panel, The Future of Work. Where else than here in Berlin is this a place to talk about this? Berlin, the center, or the capital of Germany, but also in the heart here, Humboldt University, in the heart of Berlin, where everything happens, where so much dynamics are on, where people are merging or meeting from different cultures, different communities. It's exactly the place where we should talk about these important issues, how we want to live in the future, how we should work, how we should manage all these things. And I think this is a great opportunity here to talk about this. You see this brilliant hall here where we can host this conference. Humboldt University is a modern place, a modern university. We have re-established after the break of the wall in 1993, and now we look back on almost 30 years since November, re-establishing the Faculty of Economics and Business, and we are proud of this. We are a modern faculty. We cooperate here in Berlin with all the other institutions, especially the Free University. I see colleagues here from Free University, but also from Technical University. We work together with people from the University of Potsdam, the ESMT, the Hertie School of Governance. We collaborate with the WZB and colleagues from DIW. And within this collaboration, we have established an international form of training our PhD students within the Berlin School of Economics. So we are very modern, very open. We try to meet all the international standards. And we are very happy that now we opened up a new field together with the collaboration of Alexandra Spitz-Oehner from our faculty and Christian Dustmann from London, who became an honorary professor here at our school in May. Now we are open, or we established this collaboration with the Rockwool Foundation, which we are very proud of. Hopefully they can move into their facilities and start working there. We had a meeting there yesterday in their offices, and we could only see who is responsible for the financial backup, because there were all this isolating material from Rockwool standing there, but still waiting to be implemented in the roofs and somewhere. So I guess it takes a couple of more weeks, hopefully not months, so that they can finally start working there. And we look forward for this cooperation. I think it's very, very valuable, and I wish you all now a very good panel discussion and interesting talks, and also tomorrow during the conference, inspiring insights into this very important topic. So I hand over to who? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, and have a great discussion.
So I think the message was clear. We are guests at Humboldt University, and if a guest is staying too long, then the best guest starts to become a nuisance. So we will do everything to move away. Now, let me introduce the panel. Well, first of all, David Otter, who made one mistake this week, and that was he booked a flight with Air France, which was canceled. That's why, unfortunately, he can't be with us. Iona Marinescu, Kervin Charles, David Deming. So we have an absolute fantastic panel for this very important topic, and we are incredibly grateful to Chris Giles from the Financial Times, who came to London to chair this panel. So I look very much forward to this panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian, Danielle and Jan, for that extremely kind introduction. Hello and welcome to this panel on the future of work. We've got about an hour and a half to discuss this incredibly important topic. It's a topic that everyone is talking about, and particularly if you're in the early stages of your career or you're looking forward to a career, this is the panel for you. I had quite a shock the other week. I was in a conference which was on AI, and there was a real AI expert who was giving a talk, who said that there's lots of things that AI can't do very well, but the thing it can do very well is information gathering, synthesis, and writing. And I thought, that is my job, isn't it? You know. So we are going to hear about something that really we all care about, not just technology, but the way that will interact with society, inequality, gender, race. There's a huge number of issues that we can talk about. So I'd like you all to be thinking about your questions for the panel, and maybe short statements, but really questions I think is better, so that when we open it up to the audience, we can have a really rich discussion. The way we're going to run this is we're going to have everyone give about 5 minutes, but a short opening statement, not of their research, but what they're finding very interesting in the topic of the future of work. It's one of those things that, you know, at one stage you can slightly put down the academic numbers and the econometrics, because we are now future gazing here, and past data is only a guide to the future. And we've got two Davids on the panel, and David Autor, you can't see the rest of us, so it might be a little bit difficult. So I'm going to call you David A, and David Denning, I'm going to call you David D. And David A, do you want to kick off?
Sure, I'm delighted to kick off. Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
We can hear you very well, thank you.
Great. Okay. Terrific. Well, it's an honor to be virtually here. I regret that I'm not physically there. I do blame Air France for that. I think we made that clear. And I want to say Christian looks marvelous. Okay. So what I want to talk about briefly is the topic of expertise, which I think is a useful organizing framework for understanding how technology has changed and is changing the demand for labor. So let me define terms. Expertise means the knowledge or competency to carry out some specific task or activity. For expertise to be valuable, you need two things. One is that the thing that it can accomplish is itself valuable. So it's got to be data science, not card tricks. The second is that expertise is scarce. Not everybody can do it. To paraphrase the movie The Incredibles, if everyone is expert, no one is expert. So expertise intrinsically involves scarcity. And why is this important? Because what makes labor valuable in a knowledge economy, an economy that is, basically dispensed with physical labor to a very substantial extent, or certainly just backbreaking physical labor, is expertise, the ability to carry out some important task. And people who don't do expert work are paid poorly. So think of the jobs of, cleaner, janitor, food server, daycare teacher, school bus driver, crossing guards, right? Some of these are life and death activities, but they pay poorly in every industrialized country. And it's because the skills to do them are generic. Most people can be productive at those activities with a minimal amount of training. And so we care about whether people have expert work. Now, what is expertise really varies enormously across areas. So across time periods. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, 70% of people were employed in agriculture, about 30% in artisanal work. Artisanal work meant the expertise to carry out a whole set of steps to be a cobbler, a tailor, a wheelwright. And so it was a very broad type of apprentice expertise. And that was how things got made. Starting with the Industrial Revolution, we moved into a totally different form of work organization that basically meant combining labor, machines, and managers to carry out the work that artisans did. Initially, that was extremely unskill intensive. In fact, the artisanal class was largely wiped out by the industrial era, and it took about 100 years for actually labor to become valuable in production because there was eventually a movement from unskilled work to what I'm going to call mass expertise, people who knew how to follow rules and use tools. And that was important whether you were, either in a blue collar setting working on an assembly line, or whether you're in a white collar setting in an office doing, bookkeeping, accounting, etc. That began to change again with the onset of the computer revolution, because computers can do many of those mass expert tasks. They can also follow rules and use tools. And that led to a big hollowing out of the structure of occupations in industrialized countries, where people were either moved up into professional and technical and managerial work where there's lots of decision making, lots of dealing with specialized cases that don't follow well understood rules, or downward into food service, cleaning, security, socially valuable work, but it's non-expert work. It's poorly paid. And so that's where we've been heading for 4 decades. But now that changes again. And AI changes that because AI fundamentally can do things that don't actually involve following rules or just executing procedures, right? AI can learn. It can carry out tasks that we would think of as creative if they were done by people. It can discover and invent. It can actually solve problems that we do not know how to solve. And so the question is, what does that do to the type of expertise that's going to be important going forward? Now, it's one form of that. Of course, some things will be displaced, right? Some things that are valuable will become less valuable. Many more people will be able to do computer coding. Many more people will be able to write legal documents. Many more people will be able to summarize text and synthesize information. So that actually will reduce the scarcity of expertise in certain types of work. A lot of the work that we do is expert work, and we may become less scarce. Which, if that's true, that's a good thing, because there are too few of us. We're overpaid, and we're slowing the production process down for everybody else. But the alternative possibility, or at least the complementary possibility, is that AI may also enable people with lower levels of education, without as much elite knowledge to carry out more important tasks because it can complement their expertise and provide guidance and guardrails, function as a kind of a co-pilot. So right now, most medical tasks, many of them, are done by people with an MD. But increasingly, at least in the US, they're also done by nurse practitioners who have a master's degree. Technology can enable, AI can enable more people to do a good job of diagnosing, to do some more treatment, and even prescribing, not people without medical expertise, but people with less formal expertise. This could also be true in software development. This could also be true in skilled repair if you are in the trades, if you're an aircraft mechanic. So there are many ways that the hope, or my hope, and I'm going to stop, is that AI will not just displace expertise, but it will actually reinstate skilled work for people without college degrees. Now, when I say it will, that's really the wrong term, because AI is not going to do any of this itself. This is a matter of choice of how we implement, how we build out AI. And I think this is a moment where intentionality is critical. What we can do with AI is many things. What we will do with it is a question of priorities. And in my view, the best use of it at this point for countries like the ones you guys are in or I'm in now is to make labor more valuable, especially workers who do not have elite skills, to enable them to do more expert work. And that's where I hope we'll go. So stopping there.
Thank you very much, David D. Ioana, sorry, David A. Thank you. That was me getting confused with my own system of trying to make it less confusing. Ioana, why don't you go next?
Sure. Well, David A. perfectly introduced the topic of AI, so I'm going to jump off of that. I think there are, I'd like to raise 3 questions with respect to AI. The first one, and it dovetails with what David was saying, is we have important social choices to make here. And in particular, we have to ask ourselves, who owns these AI tools now? Who will own them in the future, and who will benefit from whatever returns this technology is creating? So that raises the topic of optimal regulation, taxation, a lot of topics that we love to study in economics. And I think this is more than ever a topic of great importance that we should think more about. And the future of work is going to depend on the policies that we decide to put in place or decide not to put in place. If we decide to stick with the status quo, that's also a choice. And that's going to influence firms' decisions, workers' decisions going forward. So that's the first thing. Decisions on taxation and regulation are really important, including the status quo. The second point is that to the extent that some workers are going to be displaced by this AI technology, we have to think about what happens to these workers. And I've worked a lot on the social safety net, and this includes programs like unemployment insurance, but also other types of income replacement, including things like a universal basic income, which would ensure everybody gets a sum of cash without questions asked. And so these kinds of programs, could become an important social safety net depending on the structures of the safety net in different countries. And importantly, if you look at the research on universal basic income, people are often worried about some potential downsides like adverse impacts on labor, meaning that people might work less, as well as potentially, we've had a lot of inflation recently, so another concern is that by pumping more cash in the economy would raise inflation. Turns out neither of those concerns empirically is big. It turns out that just doesn't seem to be a big problem, at least for the small-ish UBI-like schemes that have been tried in the past. And so second then, let's think about our social safety net. How well equipped is it to deal with the potential for job loss and job disruption? And third, in terms of how do we go from here to there, we also have to think about worker power. Again, who decides? And so, one of the issues is, I talked about new policies and regulations, and that's very abstract. but there's also what's going on with social actors on the ground. And one important consideration is to think about worker power, and in particular, how much say do workers have in the kinds of technologies that are being adopted. So one way that we have to think about that is that we know from research that employers already exercise, in many cases, a lot of market power, so they in many circumstances, might have the ability to dictate, what technology is going to be adopted. But that is often counterbalanced by unionization and other forms of collective bargaining or worker organizing. And so, with AI, for example, one interesting example I just want to put out there for you to think about is that in the US, the writers in Hollywood have been striking for months, and it just only recently ended with an agreement where, so this is again for screenwriting, they agreed that essentially, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but broadly that studios cannot use AI, but writers can use AI with some conditions. So basically, it's AI to help the workers write better, but not AI for studios to replace the workers. And then you might ask, well, how can they avoid the replacement? That's where the second interesting clause comes in, that the studios must hire at least 3 writer-producers per show. So, so that's really interesting. Again, this is not necessarily the optimal policy or anything like that. I'm just showing you, here's an example of what has happened in part as a reaction to these new tools in the profession, screenwriting, where, they potentially could have a huge impact. So the third point then is to think about what sort of say workers have, in the transition and in the adoption of these technologies.
Thank you very much. And it's really interesting, that example of the screenwriters in the US, because it's also the case that companies can't enforce copyright unless a human hand has been part of the writing process. So there was clearly an incentive for the companies themselves to have at least 3 human hands, even if the human hands were then using a little machine in the corner, and they haven't settled with the actors where that doesn't apply yet. So it shows that these things are really interesting, and the institutional structure within which you work, and including the laws within which you work, is going to make this very, very interesting. Kerwin, I'm going to come to you next. I think you're going to talk a little bit about how some of the future work in a wider societal impacts.
Okay, so thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be part of this panel. I will focus my remarks on 2 phenomena that have struck me as a scholar and as someone living in the world, as they've struck everyone in the room. I'm told to speak more loudly. 4 years ago, had we gathered here, and had I said remote work, hybrid, etc., you wouldn't have known what I was talking about, so I would not have said it. COVID's arrival on the scene initiated a dramatic reorganization in the way work is conducted, with implications, I think, for the next decade that are not yet clear. I'll touch on some themes. So let's take, for example, the issue of fairness. And so in the United States, and probably here as well, there is great debate among workers about who gets however many days off. Yeah? What rule the manager imposes on workers about how often people should be present, thus and so. In those conversations, you'll observe that some set of workers must be there. Must be there. The guys who work at the front desk, the people in the kitchen, etc. They must come in. So to the extent that people regard flexibility as a job benefit, the fact that the jobs I've just described, the bluest of blue-collar jobs, tend to be occupied by the least skilled among us, racial minorities and the like, means that in equilibrium, I would imagine over the next decade, that fundamental concerns about fairness and justice and so forth, about how remote work is implemented, will become ever more salient. As a conjecture, one does not know. As I reflect on remote work and all it might mean, a couple of other things come to mind. One is the fact that when someone can do the accounting or clerical work I need done remotely. It means that a worker who's relatively assured about employment because she lives very close to Humboldt University, yeah, can no longer be so assured. Because if jobs become untethered from space, the job security she has by virtue of being proximate to the place doing the hiring will shift. Yeah? How that plays out and how it differentially plays out across different kinds of workers is something we will have to grapple with in societies like the United States and here. There is also, with respect to remote work, the issue of evaluation. How does the boss know how I did? Faculty have the benefit of saying to the boss, here are the papers I wrote yesterday. Notice, when faculty member says that, and the boss sees the vita, it is of no interest to the boss whether you wrote the paper at night, yeah, whether you wrote it on the weekend or whatever. Output determines the boss's evaluation of you. There are many jobs where it's not output, there's always this tension between the weighting given to output and input in evaluating someone's contribution. In a context in which I know you're working hard before remote because I saw you when I came into the office, yeah, versus what might be true 5 years hence when I don't see you, there are interesting questions raised about evaluation, about the surveillance that must be imposed on the worker, about how a worker who could convince her employer about her diligence by coming in early every day and leaving late, when she can no longer do that, yeah, to what things can she point that convinces this employer of her excellence, her hard work, her diligence? And then there is what we get at work. We meet friends at work. We pick up things from observing at close hand the person next to us, kind of like that. There's a kind of human capital that comes from in-person professional activity. To the extent that we shift employment remotely, as I believe will happen, and to the extent that that shift occurs unevenly across the skill and racial distribution, the implications for the skills people will have over the course of their career might be profound. I don't know, but they might be. AI has been mentioned a couple of times, and so I just want to make one word or two about that related to this inequality theme I have already touched upon. What's AI going to do for the inequalities in wages, earnings, job productivity, and the like along some of the dimensions I've mentioned? I'm not sure, nor is anyone, I think. On the one hand, one could argue that to the extent that, that minority groups or persons at the bottom end of the earnings distribution don't have access to AI tools, then they might be especially hurt from the surge in this new innovation in our lives. Yeah? On the other hand, I don't know if anyone's had the experience of having AI quickly edit something they wrote, just to check for grammar or something. It's astoundingly good and getting better by the day. Now, my grammar is pretty decent. I can imagine a different Kerwin whose grammar is not so great, for whom the ability to run something he wrote by an editor would be especially helpful. Yeah. How AI will play out, interacted with various inequalities, is something we don't know, and something I'm really keen to see. There's one final point. AI, as I understand it, and I'm not an AI expert, I am like you. I'm learning the thing as I go. Yeah. I'm told that the thing is trained. Yes? It's based on things you have typed in, your search, whatever like that, doesn't say. Which means, from my layperson's understanding, that the stock of computer or internet activity will help shape what AI spits out to you. Yeah? Is it conceivable that groups about whom negative things dominate what is already online or written, yeah, will see beliefs formed about them that AI will reify? Yes? Do you see? I don't know. But this is the kind of thing that concerns me, and the kind of thing I worry about what lies in store for us in the future.
Thank you very much. Some very, very important topics there about fairness, location, how we are evaluated in our jobs, what we gain from our jobs in terms of friendship, the uncertainty of the future that faces us. And I think this is one of this really big concern that AI will reinforce whatever's their particularly negative beliefs and might learn that very quickly. I've tried a bit with ChatGPT. We're not allowed, we've got a policy at the FT which is that we will not use any AI in our writing whatsoever. And if we do it in future in terms of sort of simple summaries or something, we'll tell readers when we did it. But just as an experiment, I asked it to write a column for me once in the style of me. And I was very pleased to see it was crap. But that was, but I'm not sure that will be rubbish for so long. David D.
All right. Excuse me. Well, last but not least, thank you very much for having me. It's a real treat to be here. I'm looking forward to the discussion today and also the rest of the conference. So I'm going to talk really quickly about skills. And I want to start just with an observation. There is something called the National Association of Colleges and Employers. This is an organization in the US that surveys every year large employers, the kinds of employers that hire college graduates every year. And they ask them a bunch of questions about their hiring practices, but they ask them every year, what are the skills that you're seeking in new hires? What are the things you're looking for new college graduates? And there's a list of things there's a free form, there's a list of things, and every year the same few things dominate the top of the list. It's on the one hand things that I would call teamwork, social interaction, verbal and written communication, working in groups, negotiation, things that have to do with dealing with people. And then the other category is what I would call problem solving or decision making. What does it mean when an employer says they want you to be a good problem solver? My interpretation of that is they don't want to tell you how to get from point A to point Z and all the steps in between. They just want you to figure it out, to use your expertise in David A's terminology. And every year these skills come out at the top amongst the qualities employers are seeking. And also they ask employers to rate college graduates on the skills that they currently possess. And college graduates typically get high marks. These are grades. They get A's or A minuses, or it's like if you're Harvard, everyone gets an A plus because the average grade is an A. But they get very high grades on things like analytical skills and sometimes on problem solving, but actually lower grades on communication, leadership, some of the things that people call soft skills. And so this has been true for a long time, and this was the kind of fact the labor market was crying out for an explanation of what these things are and how to measure them. That's what got me interested in this topic of soft skills. I think basically the conclusion I've come to is that the reason we call them soft is it's actually quite revealing. It reveals the limits of our understanding about what these things actually are. They're quite evidently important to people in the world, and they're important for determining future success, and yet we don't really have a handle on what they are. And so you can see in all manner of data and anecdotes that they're becoming increasingly important over time. For example, if you think about how work has changed, and David A. talked about some of this in his remarks, how work has changed since the commodification of information that was the digital information communication technology revolution. It really, in settings ranging from a retail bank where they had optical character recognition to a valve manufacturing plant where they adopted computer numerically controlled machines, so instead of the person physically cutting the valve, you could program a machine to do it. In all those different types of settings, white collar, blue collar, in the US and abroad, you could see that it caused jobs to shift towards this reliance on these kinds of soft skills. So, they would reorganize the factory floor so that workers communicated more, so they could figure out, okay, we have a custom batch coming through, you use that machine, I'll use this one, let's time it in a way to optimize our throughput. And they hired people with higher levels of education. They required different sets of skills that were things like problem solving, like we've got a really complex thing and you have to adapt to it. And what I take from that, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that the same skills that were valued at the dawn of the digital age will be valued going forward with AI, but I actually think it's a pretty good bet, and I want to try to convince you of that. I think the reason is that what we're really looking for is people who can fill in the blanks from a routine process. This routinization of production started with physical tasks, a bulldozer rather than a shovel. And it's moved to the routinization of information processing tasks. And so anything where you can clearly delineate the steps along the line, we found a way to automate, either through AI technology or through some physical machinery. And I think it's a good summary. This is probably not literally true, but it's close to true, that you can create or program a machine to do any one thing better than a human, no matter what that thing is. But people are general purpose technologies. People can shift from doing numerical calculations to operating a machine to talking with each other all at once and quite flexibly in response to a changing environment. And I think that's still, to this day, we never know what the future holds, but this day still is the human advantage over machines. AI is our flexibility and our adaptability. And so I think that's why you see firms asking for people who are good in teams, who can communicate with each other, because there's still a kind of unscripted magic to a 2-minute unstructured conversation, and in some cases a sharing of values, a decision sometimes arrived at jointly about what exactly are we going to do. You know, we have this AI technology that's going to make whatever we do better, but we still have to decide how we're going to use our time and our expertise and our efforts to produce something of value to society. And so I think, in a way, for me, it's a slightly hopeful message. I'm probably not a, you know, the robots are going to take all of our jobs kind of person. I think this time could be different, but history shows us that won't happen. And I think it won't happen here because a lot of the jobs that we do today are actually not really mission critical for survival. You know, most of us are not propagating the human species in our day-to-day lives, and the jobs we hold, certainly not professors like me. Instead, what we're doing is we're creating meaning in the world, and we're working sometimes in groups to decide what are the things that are important to us as a society, and how do we go about doing them. And I think our needs and our sense of what's important will change in response to technology. It'll create a bunch of new jobs and new demands for things. I think just if you want to think about a couple of categories of things that aren't anywhere close to being replaced, anything that involves mentoring or coaching, I would predict is a growth industry. You can sort of see that already. Why? Because we don't actually want ChatGPT to tell us, you know, how to be a better singer or to, you know, coach youth sports or something like that. We actually want people because people motivate each other. And the reason why my kid tries hard when they're on a team is because they care about what the coach thinks of them, and maybe they care what their father thinks. Probably not at this point since I have teenagers, but I can hope. And so I think those kinds of things are still going to be important. And actually, if you step back and look at the jobs we do, that is a lot of what we're doing already. So I think that'll continue to happen. So let me just say one more thing, and then I'll conclude. Because I think that these skills are important, and I think the reason, you know, why we call them soft, again, is because we don't understand them very well. I've tried, and I'm happy to talk about this more, to develop science-based measures of soft skills, things like how do you figure out whether somebody's good in a team? How do you figure out whether somebody's good at making decisions about resource allocation? And I think if you look at the history of all the things we measure about skills, it basically goes back to a time when somebody said, oh, we have developed this test for a specific diagnostic purpose, like that's what IQ tests were. They were developed to diagnose mental age in children when it differed from calendar age, as a way to diagnose whether somebody was slow or fast. And then we found out actually this test has a lot of predictive power in a general population, and lo and behold, it predicts a bunch of things, and we call it G because we don't actually know why it predicts things. It just turns out that it does. And that's basically the history of IQ testing, with a bunch of refinement and a lot of money spent by testing companies and subtests and retest reliability and all that. And so I don't see any reason why we couldn't do that for things like teamwork. And I think that if we did that, we'd find that those skills are just as important as the ability to score well on a pen and paper test. So I think, you know, trying to push that science forward one paper at a time is part of why I'm excited about this field, and why I really do think it relates to what are the skills that are going to be valuable in this AI-filled future. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, David. And I think we can say that all of the panel have what David D was called very good soft skills in communication. So that is very effective to have here. I'm just going to sort of pick up something that both Kerwin and David A said, which is the question of where AI, but the rest of the panel do feel free to come in as well, is the question of where AI might be substituting for the expertise that currently is, or complementing it. And David A, you were talking about what might happen to the wage distribution and where in the distribution it might well be. Does it mean that your hope was that it will be picking up or helping people with what you said were non-elite skills today? Does that then maybe create an even bigger superstar right at the top who will have real complements with the skills, and then maybe have the top just moving away from a big mass of the rest of us in the middle?
I think there will be superstars, but they're a very small part of the economy. So Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, right? They have fabulous wealth, but it's really tiny compared to the average of everything else, or the sum of everything else. I think, I've been studying inequality for decades, and it's been a great run, but actually we're in a period of declining inequality, I'm sorry to say. and many people, and so it's actually an interesting period because several things have changed all at once. One is we're in a demographic transition where the aging of our countries and the slowing of the availability of young workers has created a lot of pressure, especially at the bottom. We see this in the United States very strongly. The return to measured higher education has plateaued and has for some while. We're in the midst of a technological transition. And of course, even our trade relations, which were so fundamentally important in the 90s and 2000s, have changed again. So I think we're in an era where there's reason to think that inequality has stabilized and may decline. Maybe not at the very top, but that's important, but non-essential. I care much more about the other 99% of the workforce. And I do think AI is basically those of us in this, the highly educated individuals who are the commanding heights of our economy have had a great 4 decades. Their skills have become more valuable, more scarce. Their expertise has become more important because all the easy problems have been solved and done by machines. And they've had very little competition from technology. They've only been complemented. I actually think AI will provide much more competition for the highly skilled experts among us, make our services less scarce, but simultaneously has the potential to enable more people to do what we do. And that can be problem solving, that can be diagnosing, that can be all kinds of skilled tasks. Much of the hard work of experts is basically working from a formal body of knowledge to making a high stakes decision in a specific one-off case, right? How do I diagnose this patient? How do I land this plane under these conditions? How do I remodel this kitchen? How do I architect this piece of software? So I think there's reason to think, I hope, and I think is something to work towards, that AI can be enabling for more people who don't have very high levels of formal education. Now, I don't think it's going to, change life for people who work at McDonald's or people who do, security or, checkout at retail. But to the degree to which it siphons workers away from that work and moves them up, it benefits the workers who remain in those jobs as well by creating additional labor scarcity. So I think as a property of AI, we should be seeking to harness. It's not a given. It's only a possibility, but I think it's something we can actually design for.
Thank you, Cohen. Do you see that as the sort of more optimistic? You were talking about people who might benefit from having a grammar checker rewrite their scripts.
So I agree exactly and almost entirely with everything David just said. That the example I gave about someone for whom an editor, I picked a writing example, I could have chosen another one, would be especially helpful is someone who is currently not at the highest end of the earnings or skill distribution. And so I believe, like David does, that there is a possibility that AI will dampen inequality. I'm not certain, but it well may. What neither David nor Kerwin knows is whether the introduction of AI will spawn yet some new thing for the high end. Yeah? I don't know that, nor does David. And if that were to happen, this ameliorative effect to which I've pointed might be undone by what the Financial Times writer armed with AI might do down the line that he cannot now imagine. That said, we are in agreement about its likely ameliorative effect for the reason mentioned.
Joanna.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's unclear, and I think we don't know. But here are some reasons, just to play the devil's advocate, why it may not be that effective. So first of all, it does seem plausible that it's going to basically put a lower end on how bad the writing could be, for example, right? Because you could always ask the AI. So there's that effect. Like at the lower bound, just ask the thing, it's probably going to get better. But from my experience with the technology, and I try to use it as much as possible because I'm a learner and I'm really interested in it. So I use it for everything, coaching, decision-making, everything. Every day I use it so many times just to see how it works and see what you can do. And what I've learned, and this is personal experience, is that I thought it's magic and it's good. But to make the most out of it, it requires a lot of expertise. To know how it says something, to decipher what's not quite right, and how to ask the next question to be helped, and when actually it would be more productive for me to go to Google or to actually check the original academic article because I learned enough from what it's saying. All those decisions, to get it to that high, top, expert quality product, it's not easy. You really have to know it. And I think it's a bit analogous to Googling. There's people who have more or less great Googling skills. So it's a little bit like a thing like that, where to do it really, really well, you know, it does seem just from personal experience that you know, you kind of have to know what you're doing and be experienced with the technology.
Yeah, so I find it very hard to make directional predictions about, you know, what this is the aggregate impact on inequality or the college wage screen for all the reasons that other folks have said. But I do think it's interesting to try to maybe speculate idly about some things that are going to happen without making a claim about the final impact. I mean, one thing that I think, let me just talk about generative AI like ChatGPT and other programs. It seems likely to me that it's going to commodify and devalue digital information even more than it already is. In the same way that like people used to open the mail expecting to see things that were relevant to their lives, and now like the mail is just things I have to do and junk, and it's like slowly becoming irrelevant, and kind of honestly email is going that way too. I wonder if AI will place an increasing relative premium on the physical, on the performance. You know, so I could imagine using ChatGPT to write a paper that sounds like, you know, David Deming wrote it, or David Otter, or any of us. But it would be hard for the person who used that technology to write the paper to then sit on the panel and speak in a way that was, maybe it's hard for me to do too, but it would be hard for that person to do it for you all and speak in an interesting way about these things, because it's an interactive performance and it's not something that can be, you know, I don't know if anybody's ever seen the movie The Matrix, but you know, we still don't have this thing where you can like download Kung Fu into your head and do it. You know, you still can write something in a static sense, but that's all kind of information that sits there and isn't embodied in the person. So it could be that we'll have an increasing premium on performances, both in the classroom and then in the economy overall.
So just one other point is the notion of authenticity. This is vague in my mind. So someone writes me an apology letter or a birthday letter, and it uses AI, the person does, and it's perfect. Yeah? So that's one kind of experience I can have from that. There's another experience where I received the apology letter or the birthday greeting from my son or my nephew, and it is full of the kind of human flaws, you see? The syntax wasn't quite right, and kind of like that. Kerwin, I'm not sure about others on the panel, places a great weight on the second thing, you see? It feels authentic, it feels real, kind of like that. I wonder whether the emergence of technologies like AI would cause us to place a greater weight on many of the things that we associate with human imperfection, see? To the extent that those things reflect something real about our engagement. Yeah? Of course, every word wasn't exactly right, because you wrote it. You wrote it. And so it means and matters more to me than the ideal thing that you used a computer to generate. Again, we're in the realm of speculation here. So I just wonder what AI will do with authenticity and value.
But just to pick up on that, I think one thing that's absolutely clear just from my own industry is that, one, we know that authenticity is something that our readers really value. And they value it so much that increasingly we are not downplaying reporting, because getting news and breaking scoops is incredibly important for a news organization. But we're also just being authentic and sort of getting to know your readers and having conversations with them is now important. So we're under quite strict instructions when people comment on our articles afterwards to go into the comments and reply to emails, because that's what generates subscriptions ultimately. It's a business that needs to be funded, and we do more and more of emails and email newsletters which goes directly to people, which are much more sort of personal and have a personal tone rather than columns these days, all of which is totally then monitored to the extent where there's a score at the end of an email, 1 to 5, how much did you like this? That is then a league table internally, which you can look at, how many people opened it, what the open rate was, how many new subscribers you've got. All of these things are then monitored very carefully. In a way, that means that also we're quite lucky because we can do this remotely. So I wrote a column this morning from my hotel room. I wasn't in work, even though we're supposed to be in work 3 days a week, and no one's going to pull me up on that later. But Jana, I wanted to ask you, again, just to go a bit deeper into the institutional sort of framework we need to go into the future with. You talked a little bit about social security or social safety nets, UBI. Is this a world where we need to have stronger institutions, minimum wages or wages councils? You know, we're in Germany here, so it's an important, these are very important things in the German labour market. For example, much less so obviously in the US, but what do you see the role of labour market institutions in the future?
So as I said, I think those institutions are going to determine our adaptation response to, you know, this technological change. You know, it's really difficult to know where exactly this is going to go. And, you know, some people fear that all jobs or most jobs are going to go away, and then, you know, you want to have an alternative. But you could also say that no matter what, something like UBI or unconditional cash transfer is neutral in the sense that, you know, if you talk about, it's like, because it's a lump sum transfer, sorry, I'm getting a little bit technical here, but basically you get it no matter what, and you can still go work and make more money, you know, if you wish to do so, with or without the help of those tools. So you know, that's just a particular point to that policy. But in terms of the other policies, you know, I suspect that outcomes are going to be different in areas where there's a lot of union power versus not. It's probably going to change, you know, the way that the labor market responds to these technologies in complex ways, you know. But certainly, unions naturally are going to try to defend the position of the workers who currently have a job, because that's their constituency. They're there to help the workers. And so that probably will have some effects, like we talked about the example of the Writers Guild. So I think that's going to be you know, really important.
There is a question, David A. I mean, just moving on from that, so following on from that, it raises a question of the power of governments or regulatory bodies to be able to regulate in a new world where, you know, where borders are not necessarily so clearly defined as they used to be. And also the whole question of trade, borders, jobs is something you've worked on a lot in your career. How do you see that going in the future?
Well, let me not answer that question. No, let me build a little bit on what Ioana just said about these, you know, the regulation and encroachment. I mean, I think actually the example that you gave a minute ago, Chris, about sort of how, you know, how the FT is monitoring, you know, your productivity in a way that was purely inconceivable, right? You know, 5 years ago, is an interesting example of another one of the effects of the technology that's neither kind of labor complementary or labor substitution. It's the ability to surveil and use information at a very granular level. And it actually, you know, potentially shifts bargaining power from workers back to employers, right? Because if an employer can really, you know, a lot of the work that we do, you know, we think of as, well, it's hard to monitor, it's hard to measure, right? You just have to invest in the person and they do what they do best. But if the employer really feels like, well, I can just actually, I can measure how much, you know, how many customers you've pleased, you know, how many subscribers you've gotten, well, that kind of makes it much harder for you to just, you know, bargain as a, you know, I'm just Chris, I'm great at what I do, you need to hire me, right? And so I do think this is one of the challenges we need to think about is surveillance and the use of workplace monitoring, the way that changes negotiations. Similarly, you know, much is said about bias, but I want to come back to what Kerwin said a minute ago about, you know, the cache of information that's on the web is very non-representative, and that's what AI is trained on. I mean, many of you may know this already, but this is kind of shocking thing I learned last summer, actually this summer, which is, you know, when Google first introduced its face recognition software for photographs, there were a bunch of complaints when it mislabeled African-American families as gorillas. And this was horrifying. To this day, if you go to any photo identification site and upload a photo of gorillas and ask, what is this? It will say, I don't know, not sure. And the reason is because the training data is just not rich enough, and it's likely to make that type of mistake again. And so the truth is that AI in its current form, if guardrails are not placed all around it, it will spew out horrible content. And so I do think the way that the guardrails we put on this and the way that we regulate it or control it are incredibly important. The Hollywood writer strike, they've accomplished something that I did not think was actually possible, which was to basically negotiate about how AI would not be used. But it's kind of an inspiring example. I'm not saying they hit the bliss point of how to do this, but I do think we are in an incredibly high stakes moment where a lot of consequential decisions are quickly going to be baked in. And so we need to think very hard and fast about how we, what we want to maintain control over, how we want to shape how this is diffused.
So just if I can.
Go ahead.
Surveillance. I think, David, that's such an important point, and I think where it could be potentially even more damaging to worker bargaining power is when the employer, through their surveillance, not only can look at your productivity, that's one thing, but can determine how little you would be willing to be paid to stay in this job. For example, they know that your spouse is sick, that you cannot move, thanks to their surveillance, and they are able to pay you less. And that would happen if they have the information, and if there is no competition. So if there's not many other options that you could do, then they would be able, potentially, to drive you down to the minimum that you would be willing to accept, whereas if they don't have the information, they may not be able to do that. So that's another way how it could affect worker bargaining power.
So that's another reason why we need to think really carefully about the institutional framework around the jobs of the future. David D., I wanted to come back to your characterization of what you called soft skills or communication, coaching, all of those sorts of things, and get to an issue which comes from what we've just been talking about, surveillance. Quite a lot of people find that it quite overbearing. I don't particularly mind what happens in my job yet, but I can imagine I might if they went much further. How satisfied do you think, how much pleasure do you think people will get out of the jobs in future?
That's a subjective question that is hard to answer. It probably depends on the person and their own attitude, but I would say probably more than they are now, because that's been the trend for a long time. You look at the average hours people have to work and working conditions, not that long ago, were much, much worse than they are for most people today. So I would hope that, and it somewhat depends on the regulatory issues that were just being discussed, I would hope that the technology ultimately delivers rising living standards and rising working conditions in jobs, whether it's fewer working hours or whether it's more pleasant working conditions. Working from home is a big aspect of that Kerwin talked about. In some sense, that's kind of like, from a compensating differential standpoint, the work from home shock is like one of the biggest benefits to workers delivered all at once in a long time, maybe ever. If you just monetize it times, how much are you willing to pay? And Alex Moss and others have done work on this. How much are you willing to pay to be able to work from home rather than go into the office? And then all of a sudden you get millions and millions and millions of people around the world being able to do that because of a combination of global pandemic and the tightest labor market, at least in the US and many other countries, in a generation. That's the kind of thing that is not really about AI, actually. Like, a lot of these surveillance technologies we're talking about have been around for a while. I think what we have now is we have a labor market that's tight enough that people say, well, I need to allow my employees to work from home, and if I surveil them too much and make their jobs too unpleasant, they'll quit and go elsewhere. And so I think one solution is to try to regulate things technology by technology and get the details right. Another way to do it is to ensure that workers have enough bargaining power that they can shop around for good working conditions, and therefore workers won't surveil them. I guess based on recent evidence, I'd kind of lean toward the latter, because that seems to be what's working so far.
Yeah, it certainly is the case that having tight labour markets just generally is much better for workers. And given the demographic pressures, that might well be, in advanced economies at least, might well be what's around in the future. So we should never get too pessimistic about things. Now, it's October, and we have a Nobel Prize was always awarded in this month. And it was this month to Claudia Golding. And we haven't talked about gender yet or greedy jobs, which was one of her latest concepts about one of the real reasons for, particularly for very well qualified women, why they are still paid a lot less than men, particularly after having children. Are jobs going to be greedy in the future? I don't know who wants to answer that. David A., do you want to give that a go first?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So first of all, it's a thrill, an honor to celebrate Claudia Goldin's Nobel Prize. She has been a singular force, moving this agenda forward of understanding how women have gained rights over time, what has held them back, how that has, and what are the barriers now. And this argument about greedy jobs, and her argument that time is actually the greatest barrier now, the competition between home and work, and the inseparability of jobs, the indivisibility. So I think all of us are just in the profession just feel like this is a huge step forward for the social science as well as for Claudia Goldin. So let me say, and also I realize I'm grandstanding here, but you should go listen to her podcast with Orly Ashenfelter, where she talks about her years at Princeton. In the 6 years that she was a junior faculty member there, she was never invited to give a professional seminar. She never set foot in the industrial relations section or had lunch with the labor economists there. So the world has, it sounds shocking, but this was only 30 years ago. So she is not just doing the research, but emblematic of the struggle and the progress that women have made. So will we have greedy jobs in the future? Sorry. Why? Well, it's useful to ask, why do we have such greedy jobs now? And one part of the answer is that, the scarcity comes from scarcity. It used to be, back in the 1970s, people with college educations worked only a few more hours per week than people without college educations. They all worked about, between 35 and 45 hours, or maybe 45 and 55. After the 1980s, they totally diverged, where high-wage people work many more hours per week and per year, often 60, 70, 80, and low-wage workers work fewer than 40. This is very strongly true in the US, and neither of those is good, right? People with low education are underemployed, and people with high education are overemployed. Partly that reflects the scarcity that that has driven up the college wage premium. Partly it reflects the technology of work, where we don't know how to say, well, let's two people, divide this legal case. And partly it may reflect norms about, we structure work in a way that's convenient for men because those are the people who've been making decisions. I think we can make progress on this. I don't know if technology is our friend or our foe. You might have thought that the ability to work from anywhere would kind of make us more flexible, but to a substantial extent, the ability to work from anywhere means the ability to never not be working. And so it's not been nearly, the penetration of work into homes has actually arguably made this worse. The pandemic did change work from home, as Kerwin noted, and that has been mildly favorable for women, as far as I know, but not substantially. So I guess my best answer is I don't know.
Joanna.
So I think the working from home, the commuting is very important. In fact, here we have Thomas Le Barbanchon, who wrote a really nice paper about commuting and women's wages in France, where we see that women are much less likely to accept a long commute and therefore willing to accept lower wages. So if you can work remotely, in principle, that should help. And I think it ties into the broader idea that I was explaining earlier about the relative power of workers versus employers, and workers really value, all workers, not just women, value distance to the job. And so when there are jobs that are closer, you're willing to essentially get paid less in order to get a closer job. That's true for everybody, it's just that women have that more. And that's one of the ways in which workers' options are somewhat limited due to this distance, which has been traditionally really important and perhaps is going to become less so, at least for the jobs that you can do from home.
Right, I think it's time for you to do some work now in the audience and come and ask questions or make comments from the floor. I think we've got a fabulous panel here, so don't be shy. If you could raise your hand and I can't see people are being shy, but at the moment, no, fantastic. We have two people. Have we got a roving mic? We're just checking on the mic, and then we have, and it works apparently. So the man with the beard in the fourth row.
Information, misinformation, is AI making information easier to get and make sense of?
Who wants to go?
You.
Okay. Is AI making information easier to get? Yes, of course it is. It also means, so Google, when you search for something, has a lot of AI behind that in the way it brings up a search result. It means you can find papers and relevant topics more easily. You can also find, if you wanted to, you could go to ChatGPT and just write an English language question about something you were working on. You do need to have a certain amount of expertise, I would say, to be able to interpret what it comes out with and to check it. Just like a Google search, you need to know whether that's worth the paper it's written on or the screen it's written on, I should say. And there, it's always helpful to have expert staff around you to check things. Always ask before you publish, I think would be my
Can I add to that quickly, Chris? So I think that's right. And if you think about how people consume information, it's usually the information itself paired with the reputation of the provider. And so if you make the one thing cheap, it seems likely that the other thing's going to become really important. So I think it's reasonable to predict that both news organizations and then individuals' ability to build reputation and to maintain reputation will be extremely important in the age of AI when it's so cheap to create the information in the first place.
Can I just add one tiny point? I think we live in a world where we have more and more information and less certainty about truth, and those things are not an accident. And the problem is that information has lost its authority. And that, when I grew up, when I was going to school, information was scarce. You tracked it down. You believed facts. And the hard part was acquiring them. Now you can acquire all the information you want, but you don't know what's reliable. And I think AI is going to make that problem much worse. I don't think even, the notion, oh, here's the video, here's the audio, not convincing, right? We had a bombing of a hospital in Gaza the other day. It's knowable, how that actually happened. But the two sides will never agree on the narrative. And they can always, and even if the facts that are produced appear real, you can always say, oh, that was AI, that was fake, right? So I think we're going to have a huge problem with verification. I agree that makes the importance of reputation all the more significant. However, you can have reputation as Sean Hannity, you can have reputation as CNN, right? So different people believe different reputational sources. There's less centralized agreement on what reliable information actually is.
One thing that reputable news organizations are doing right now is investing in new types of journalistic skills. So rather than people who have a very long contact book, who can phone someone up and see what they say, we are now valuing more people who can do data and who can do, understanding what photography and what video is actually showing you, so the sort of geolocation of stuff. And those are definitively growing jobs in my news organization. There was a gentleman there.
Thank you. Wonderful discussion. Thank you very much. Maybe as a matter of politeness, I'm Guido Friebel, Goethe University Frankfurt, and also a member of RF Berlin. So I was thinking about this idea of what gives employees actually bargaining power when they try to quote unquote constrain the use of AI, or basically it's evidently a problem of governance, and you alluded to works councils in Germany that often are perceived as having too much power and so on. But there seems to be an unknown in this equation, and that's trade. We know that currently the big blocks, the big economic blocks in the world have very different approaches to using these new technologies, where the European Union is very restrictive in what is allowed, what is not allowed, GDPR, you know, all these data protection things and so on. It's much easier in the US to develop these things. It's much easier to use them. Worker power is lower, but we haven't even started talking about India and China. Put differently, do we even still have the leeway to decide how this is going to be used, or will this be decided on the global market?
Joanna.
I'm going to punt to somebody else this time. Well, okay, then I'm going to speculate, and this is a little bit stating the obvious, and this goes to remote work. So the thing is, with remote work and all this technology, arguably, workers are more than ever in competition with everybody else around the world in that sense. And therefore, if some countries have regulations that are much more permissive of use of various technologies, AI, surveillance, etc., and if that leads them to have a competitive edge, you know, that can have important effects through that competition. And of course, then, you know, governments in countries that have different views about how AI, surveillance, and all that should be used would have to react. And, you know, how you do that, it's a question, like, because, you know, you could you know, if you use the example of carbon taxes, I kind of like that example, right? There's border adjustment taxes, where we decide that, you know, carbon emissions are bad. Of course, it's also an externality, so it's not completely directly comparable, but, you know, and then we say, well, we're gonna tax what's coming in based on the carbon content. So, you know, you could imagine things in that direction, but again, how you do it exactly is obviously difficult and complicated.
David A., could you envisage a new China shock? Could you envisage a new China shock coming from this sort of technology, where worker rights are much lower in certain countries, China or India or any country?
Yeah, so there's already really excellent research on this by my colleague Martin Bracha, David Yang of Harvard, and Noam Yuckman of LSE. And you know, I stressed the point earlier that how we use AI is really open-ended. So, for example, China has the world's best surveillance technology, the world's best real-time content filtering systems, and these are amazing technological achievements. They would be unattainable without AI, but they're not intrinsic to AI. Obviously, you can use AI for many things. But China is exporting those technologies to non-democratic governments around the world. And so they have a different model. They can consider a better model of what governance should look like. It's much more authoritarian. It's much less democratic. And they consider, I don't want to say they, I should say President Xi and so on. I don't want to overcharacterize, but, you know, the societies we live in the West are moribund, disorganized, dysfunctional, and decadent. And those are just the D words. And so there is a race to embody a set of values in AI and export it to different countries. And so I do think that's a form of China shock that we're seeing, that we are in a world diplomatic contest between the West and non-democratic governments to export models of how to rule. And AI is going to be just central to that. It's incredibly powerful for centralization of power. The level of surveillance that's feasible and so population control is it's sort of it's the panopticon that we've always read about but never thought to take seriously. So that will be a shock. In terms of trade, I could speak about exactly the point Joanna had made about labor standards, but I think she made it very well. So let me not take more airtime.
Okay. Can I just add quickly? I think one important dimension on the question of worker bargaining power in the age of AI and what can they do? I think one critical element is the extent to which the job tasks can be bundled or unbundled. So if you're a waiter, for example, I mean, maybe there's some ways that AI can augment that job, but at the end of the day, people want a person serving their food, most people do. And so that gives the worker more power over the other parts of the process because you can't unbundle the person, but there's some jobs that can be quite atomized. So for example, back office, payroll, finance type stuff, the same jobs that are allowed to be fully remote now, that's probably a way station to those jobs being almost completely or completely automated, because if you never have at any point in the job's task set, you don't need a person to do it, then you can just kind of use technology to do it. And so I think what you'll see is some elements of jobs that used to be bundled together being unbundled in ways that allow firms to use technology instead, and that'll be part of the bargaining process.
So yeah, I think that's a great point, but this leads me to circle back to authenticity that Kerwin talked about earlier. And I think a critical question in terms of how AI will complement or substitute is how much do we value the human behind it? Namely, do we merely value a result, an outcome? I want my accounting done, the end. Whether there's a human or not, I couldn't care less. Or do we value something about the human? And in many contexts, you might think that you value the human, but then I'll invite you to think again, because social norms change. And one of the things, if you read in the press, is the AI girlfriend. Just Google it. You'll see it's apparently a thing, and more people are using it, and people are very happy with it. Again, like this is a small example, but you might think...
It's a family program, okay?
No. but you might think, oh, who wants that? But clearly there's a demand. We're economists here.
There's an old saying in show business that the key to success in Hollywood is authenticity. So if you can fake that, you've got it made. And AI will be very good at faking that.
Okay, so questions from the floor. We haven't had any questions from any women or particularly young people yet, so do ask. But yes, sir.
Thanks. I'm afraid I don't qualify as either of these two categories. Felix Weinhardt, thanks a lot for this really interesting discussion. I have a friend who about half a year ago was he's a freelance software developer. He was really concerned that AI would replace his job, and that everyone could be doing the coding that he was doing. And I met him a couple of weeks ago, and he told me, well, a lot of his colleagues don't actually use it. But he himself claims he got about 10 times more productive. Yeah, so I thought it was very interesting to listen to you and to these ideas of AI helping the lower skilled to basically do more things. But I mean, this is just an N=1 experience. But it seems that this kind of talking about skills, so the skills or the expertise, how to productively use AI in order to get from A to B, that's going to make individuals it's not going to displace specific individuals, just a lot more productive, and of course potentially then displace others. So potentially really increasing again wage inequality, etc. So I'd be interested in your views on this. Thanks.
So first off, obviously, I do want to clarify. I said I use AI a lot, but there's regulations in my work, just as in your work. So when it's not permitted, I don't use it. Just to be clear. But on the other hand, how to use it is important. And I'd say very informal. But for me, I'd say like in sort of general purpose writing and decision things where I can use it, it probably increased productivity by maybe 20%, not 10 times. But 20% is not nothing. So I don't know how other people, what was your experience? Talk to me about it later. I'm really fascinated by this issue. So if you have hacks about using AI, I want to hear all about it.
Other questions from the audience? There's just in that row.
So we've heard a lot about the future of work, and I'm wondering what that implies for the future of skills and of training. So let's say for our students or for our children, right? And we've heard about the importance of social skills and those kinds of skills. But then, what about technical skills, right? So should we still teach our students technical skills, or should we assume that AI deals with that somehow? I mean, this is speculation, right? But I would be curious what you think about that.
It's a great question. Should the economics students be learning econometrics, or should they just let the machine do it for them?
Well, I would say to both my students and the other students, they should still learn it. I think actually the reason is related to Ioanna's point and some other points that David Otter made about expertise, which is that actually thinking about these things like a multiplier for whatever you're trying to accomplish, you sort of have to have a sense of what you're trying to do. So like, it's fine to say that ChatGPT can invert a matrix, like, do some econometrics, but like to what end, for what purpose, what data are you analyzing, what question are you asking? And I think if you look at the way most very successful people become that way, they typically take some process and think or reinvent some process or reinvent some topic by taking it apart one step at a time and reinventing it in some unusual way. So I think actually the depth of understanding something, not just using AI or not using shortcuts, but really reinventing or inventing a process from whole cloth, gives you a lot of insight into how to do things better. So I don't see why that would change, primarily because most of the high stakes work we do is not just producing content, but it's actually using the content towards some purpose. I think I brought up this thing about performances earlier, like you might make a presentation to people, or you might have to convince someone that their point of view is wrong and your point of view is right. And you have to, I think, have a pretty deep understanding to teach people, to persuade people. So I mean, I don't know, but you're asking me to speculate, so that's what I'm doing. But I wouldn't say that people should just be using this to purely replace the things they're doing, because you're going to hurt your ultimate ability to gain expertise and compete.
David A., did you want to come in there?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. So a few points. One, just building on what David Deming just said, you wouldn't want to go to a doctor who basically said, I don't know anything about medicine, but I got this box here, so I'll just read from the screen and, if I need to do surgery, I'll just follow the instructions, right? So I think people need expertise to make good decisions. Now, it's a question of what level, right? So to drive a car, you don't need to understand how a car works, but you need to understand certain things, right? And so, it may be in the future that coding will require less knowledge of the syntax of specific languages and more knowledge of sort of, abstractions of, data structure and, efficient procedures. So I think there are some forms of technical knowledge that we can do without. But if you don't get the big picture and don't have the deep understanding, you're really in danger. And, we see this, with, commercial air pilots, right? They're in many cases, their expertise has been degraded by use of autopilot, such that there have been terrible fatalities, tragedies, where pilots don't understand what's happening in a plane. So I think we need to worry about that. But it is difficult to figure out what things need to be learned and what it means to be a master of something when many of the technical details can be taken care of for you. So two other comments, and I don't want to run long. One, I think actually there's going to be, this was said earlier as well, I think we may see a movement more into physical work, right? We actually have, due to scarcity of young people, we have a shortage of people in the trades in many countries. And I think people say, look, AI is not going to replace plumbing. It's not going to rewire a house. It's not going to remodel a kitchen. And so we may see some movement of that. But the last point I want to make about skills and training is this technology has a lot of potential to improve the efficiency of learning because it can make it more immersive, more accessible, more customized, and cheap. And we can do it in different modalities, right? So pilots spend multiple days a year in flight simulators, right? Because you actually need to get the learning into your backbone, into your spinal column, but you can't do it on a plane. It's too expensive. It's too risky. More adult learning could take the form of simulation. Adults don't really like going back to class. I don't know why. Class is so fun, but they could learn more rapidly through working in virtual environments. So I think we should purpose the technology. We should use the technology as an asset for improving the efficiency with which we educate, especially for people who need to acquire new skills, even if they can't quite download it in the matrix form yet.
Woman in the second row here.
Alexandra Spitz-Oehner, Humboldt University and Rockwool Foundation, Berlin. Hi, David. I was kind of missing the context of demographic changes in the discussion. I mean, it was very interesting, but kind of most countries face the challenge of aging population. And so this country is now starting a period where the baby boomers will go into retirement. And so maybe also to get a little bit more positive outlay on the issue of technological changes and also AI. So kind of the hope could be that there are productivity increases that kind of help to make up for this declining workforce. And so I would be very happy if the panel could also comment on this.
I agree with the point entirely. There's not much to add to it. I think that the productivity possibilities to which you point might more than account for aging populations and other sort of adverse... Look, productivity overall could be declining over the next couple of decades as countries like this, elsewhere in Europe, see, as you mentioned, as they continue to age. Is it conceivable that we could extend the productive life of the elderly? Once you pass a certain age, elderly doesn't... that's what I mean. Could we see that there's an extensions of one's productive life deep into further into one's life as AI and other technologies come on board? I think that's very possible. Something that has been mentioned I want to touch on, if I may, has to do with these new technologies, AI and other technologies, on the value we derive from leisure. So the phenomenon called work is everywhere and always this trade-off, this competition between going to sell my wares in the market and staying home and doing other stuff, playing pool, shooting video game, whatever like that. I wonder how these new technologies will affect what we observe in the labor market because of how they shift the pleasure we derive from time spent at home, time spent out of the market doing fun stuff. I don't know what that is, but I could imagine that we might see dramatic changes over the next couple of decades in labor supply, say among the young, if it's the case that AI's contributions dramatically improve the well-being they derive from non-work activity. Do you see? That was true with other technologies that came online. AI might be among them. I just want to mention that because it's something we have not yet talked about.
Joanna, I suppose the question just moving on age, because we've talked about race and gender, but age is something that is definitively going to be with us in the future labour market pretty much everywhere. And we've talked quite a bit about the regulation of labour markets, but when countries have tried, for example, to force people to work longer rather than just allow them to work longer, France earlier this year, for example, it goes down incredibly badly. How do we deal with that in a future labour market?
That's a tough one. I mean, it's funny, Kerwin, I know you've worked on this. One interesting aspect about retirement is that we have evidence that Kerwin produced that retirement actually, for many people, has a negative impact on your well-being. And so it's kind of paradoxical that people are up in arms against this when, perhaps you want to say a bit about your own research there.
You summarized it very well, that look, people derive a lot of, the act of the thing called work is this thing from which you receive material flow and so on. We get that. But we derive self-worth from work. We have friends and partners at work and on and on. And so the papers to which Joanna refers are papers of mine that a long time ago examined how people's subjective well-being changed upon retirement. And people feel less happy once they retire. Now, I don't know that continues into the modern generation. I just don't know, nor do I, my earlier point about how these technologies might change the utility flow people receive while retired. But there's a possibility that to the extent that we see people shift into retirement earlier and in larger numbers, larger numbers earlier, we might see a dramatic reduction in subjective well-being. I don't know.
Right, but let me add one more thing about the issue, which is that I think we have to also think about macroeconomic models here. So We have a bunch here, but we're mostly kind of on the micro-ish side. And the issue with aging and declining population growth is that this could be very bad for long-term growth and innovation. And while it's nice to have more productivity, but then you have this other aspect, so it's complicated, in terms of how you would expect that shrinking population to affect the economy and the labor market.
I was going to say the edge case for this conversation is college professors who have pretty easy jobs and never retire because they can continue to get paid forever. And remote work has only made that more true. People don't have to come to the office anymore.
We've got quite a few questions right at the back. There's a...
Thank you. My name is Yuri. So you've been talking about, or we've been talking about here, the malicious actors, as in nation states mostly. But a precondition for the future of work is that there is a future. And these days, when AI researchers pushing the frontier of what is possible, when they're not looking at the equity values, they tend to worry about so-called alignment issues. With alignment issues being, well, how do we make sure that this new AI model or AGI model that we built don't end up unintentionally killing us all, more or less? So I was just wondering, how worried is our panel about that? Like, would you assign a probability to us all turning into paperclips? And if so, how soon? And how should we avert that future with policy, if any? Thank you.
Okay, so a really existential question there. Jan, I'm going to ask you, since you've talked more about the regulations, to how do we prevent, rather than, let's not say whether we think it's going to happen or not, because I think the answer is we don't know, but how do we make sure it doesn't happen?
So this is all pretty speculative. Let me say that my husband is a top expert in AI, and he doesn't think that the AI killing us all is at all very likely. Of course, nobody can exclude anything. Nevertheless, it's an existential threat, so even a tiny probability, is something that we might perhaps want to be concerned about. I think one of the, and this again is very speculative, but one of the ways you might want to think about this is the decentralization of power. So I think one of the concerns with a rogue AI or anything scenario like that is that if one AI is incredibly powerful and there's no, it's like all checks and balances, right? If you don't have any checks and balances, that might, be problematic. So I think, one of the things you want to worry about is how your regulation promotes or impairs, the availability of many different AIs that are decentralized and potentially able to combat each other versus having one that, could lead to bad outcomes. But this is very speculative. So, I don't feel highly confident in this, but I think it's interesting to think about that because that's one of the elements that might lead to particularly worrisome outcomes.
Christian. David, did you want to say something here?
If I may, if that's okay.
Of course.
So we have an expression in the United States: guns don't kill people. People kill people with guns. And AI is not going to kill people. People are going to kill people with AI. It's a very powerful tool, and it can be weaponized very readily. And we certainly should be extremely worried about that. Not because we'll be turned into paper clips, but something else that will intentionally. But I think we should also recognize that we are actually awash in dangerous technologies, and we have and we do a surprisingly good job of actually not killing ourselves on a regular basis, despite all the many ways that are available to us, and not just killing ourselves but killing one another. So if you think about it, we've had nuclear weapons for 8 decades. They've only been used once in offensive warfare. That's an amazing accomplishment. It would have been hard. I think few people who were there at the birth of the atomic bomb would have predicted that was even remotely possible, that we could have gone 8 decades without dropping another bomb. Or another example, you might say, well, bombs, they're very centralized, but think about the 9/11 attacks on the United States. if you had asked people the day after 9/11, what's the likelihood that we'll go the next 23 years without a similarly catastrophic terrorist attack on the homeland, I think most people would have said, yeah, just about zero. Of course it will happen now that we see how easy it is to do, and yet it hasn't. So I think that's not exactly a case for optimism, but it's a case for recognizing we're somehow better at dealing with the existential threats that we create for ourselves than we might give ourselves credit for. So I'm hoping that we have as good a track record with AI, despite how dangerous it is, as we do with biological weapons, as we do with nuclear weapons, or even as we do with non-state terrorist acts.
But David, isn't the fear of AI, as fear about AI, that it might operate without human agency? That the second use of a nuclear weapon, tactical or otherwise, requires that some guy tells another guy to shoot it, kind of like that. That's my understanding of AI. And again, I'm not an expert.
Yeah, no, that's the autonomous, non-aligned killer AI thing. I just think that happens much. I hope we live long enough for that. Using each other conventional way with AI first.
Yeah. All right.
But that's where the counterpower, it's like you have your army of AIs, but I have mine, I mean, I would like to think about nuclear deterrence.
Yeah,
David
sure.
was raised that. I think that's really important.
Yeah, no. I mean, a lot of what we'll use AI for is to defend ourselves against AI. We already are.
Christian.
Well, the power of AI. This was a fascinating discussion, and I learned a lot about AI. And it could have been a session on AI in future labor markets. Now, the title is, however, The Future of Work. And I would just like to ask all of the participants in this discussion, suppose we would have done the same panel 1 year ago, before ChatGPT had been introduced. What would have been the main points you would make about the future of work? And perhaps our profession as academics, where ChatGPT was actually, I mean, we talked about AI when I went to university in the 80s, and there was persistent and constant progress. But well, a few months ago, ChatGPT came out, and the academic profession was entirely shocked in one way or another. So is that actually something we overvalue as academics, and actually the future of work is not just AI, there were other things which we would have discussed had we done this panel 1 year ago?
David D., why don't you?
Yeah, it's a great question, Christian. I think my answer would be yes, we probably do overrate it with respect to questions about work. Now, there's a different question, which is AI going to change society? I think it's, you could say it might end up having bigger impacts on culture and other things in society than it does on work, or not. But I do think that, we may be overlooking some other things, remote work was a very big deal a year ago. It's probably still been a much bigger deal in the near term for how work, in terms of how it's changed work than AI. Now that may not be true in the future, but it makes sense to pay attention to it. I'd also add, I mean, maybe you don't think about this, but like the development of drugs like Ozempic. If it's actually true that these are miracle drugs that can end obesity, which is one of the biggest scourges, at least in the US, in terms of public health, like that could end up having a bigger aggregate impact on labor markets than AI, potentially. So I do think there's a lot of other things that people are focusing on and should be focusing on, which is not to diminish from this like killer robot story. And if anybody watches The Simpsons, I'd say, I, for one, welcome our insect overlords. I'm ready for it. Go ahead, turn me into a paperclip. Just give me a good job on the line. No, but I think there's a lot of things we should be focusing on, absolutely.
Owen.
Yeah, I think I started my comments with a non-AI example. You'll recall. I mentioned a thing we would have been talking about a year ago, which is remote work. That's just one example. I think that will remain an important feature of employment-related conversations for at least the next decade. Look, I look at the life tables and I'm assured that people are living ever longer. Yeah? I look and I think, when it is the case, The Economist had something recently, maybe it was Financial Times, I don't remember, that it's conceivable that humans will live to 110 or something. Someone said it. And I read that and I thought, what in God's name would you do at age 94? And it's a serious question. How many careers will we adopt? Will we, do you say, do we work and then move into something we like? There are hugely important questions about work, leave out the picture, that are as yet unsettled. And we don't, I feel very nervous about offering a speculation. But those are just two things that come to mind. How over the course of career, as career and lifespans extend, and what I've discussed about remote work. There are other examples.
Joanna.
So by and large, I don't think I would have changed my introductory remarks talking about monopsony power, social safety nets, the importance of taxation and regulation, because I think those are evergreens, you know, so to speak. But it's true that the topic of AI then occupied us quite a bit, and I think it's probably for good reason, because there are a lot of unknowns still about the technology, and so I think part of the fascination is to us collectively working through the possible futures that it could have. But you know, I agree with Corinne, like, that there's other topics, but I do feel like it makes sense that we're talking a lot about AI because it's so unsettled and there's still so much to learn.
David A.
Yeah, I think I would have said the same thing without using the word AI, which is that we have a real interest in the quality of work. And we don't have to look to the future for our nightmare technological scenario, because we've been living it for 40 years, because the last 4 decades have actually been pretty terrible for people who don't have college degrees, especially in the United States. And that has a lot to do with technology, because we've hollowed out a lot of the good jobs for people without elite skills. And work is valuable. It's valuable for many reasons. It gives people structure, it gives them meaning, it gives them identity, it gives them social status, friends. But it's also really good as a means of income distribution, because unlike capital, in a society without slavery and chattel service, everybody owns exactly one worker, which is themselves, and so that creates an intrinsic degree of baseline equality in the distribution of income. And if we lived in a world where all the income basically came out of a hole in the ground, whether in the form of oil or in the form of AI, we would have a terrible governance problem and a terrible problem of how we actually distribute that. And the fact that it's abundant doesn't mean we wouldn't go to war about it every single day. So I think we have a lot of shared interest in preserving the labor market as a central means of income distribution, where it's 60 or 70% of the economy. And that means that people need to have skills that are scarce, that are valuable. And I'm very worried about that. And the center that I run with Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson on Shaping the Future of Work, this is our central focus, which is restoring good jobs for people without elite levels of education. I think AI can actually be an ally in that, but the problem is a grave one, and you don't have to look forward. You don't have to wait for it to become a grave one. It already is.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that I think we're now out of time, and I thank you, Christian, for asking a perfect last question. I'm going to tell you off for criticizing the panel, which I thought was far more wide-ranging than just talking about AI, just noting down what we have been talking about in the future of work over the past hour and a half. We have talked about AI, we've talked about fairness, discrimination, regulation, safety nets, institutions, skills, both soft and valuable, complements and substitutes to technology, surveillance, how all this affects society, the future of work, and greedy jobs. So I think we have actually managed to achieve quite a lot in the panel. Thank you very much to the two Davids, to Joanna and to Kerwin. It's been a really stimulating hour and a half. Thank you very much.
We accomplished a lot, and we only put one person to sleep in the whole audience.
Thank you, Chris, for expertly running this conversation. I thought it was terrific. Thanks for involving us.